our kids are online. They don't tell us what they're doing. What MacArthur has funded, has also funded is a study to understand how are young people participating with digital media, which we think is a significantly more important question. Mimi Ito is here. She's sitting in the back, and she'll be presenting, I think, tomorrow. Mimi conducted a 3-year ethnographic study with 25 other colleagues. It's the largest ethnographic study ever conducted in the United States on young people's participation with digital media. 700 kids across the entire United States looking at how they're participating with digital media. I will say up front, there's nothing more embarrassing than presenting the findings of another researcher's study in front of them, but I'm going to do that right now. A couple of findings that I want to say that are relevant for today and for what I want to talk about from Mimi's study. The first is that there are at least two differences, or two different kinds of genre, as Mimi would call them, two different kinds of genre for how young people participate with digital media. And she refers to these as friendship-driven and interest-driven. Friendship-driven is what you are all familiar with because it is what the media talks about and writes about constantly. Friendship-driven is what young people do in Facebook. David Fitzpatrick, I think, is talking right now at the same time about the Facebook effect, which is a book I've just finished reading. And in it, he describes exactly what Mimi found in her study, which is what the purpose of Facebook is for people to find out what their friends are doing. And in an ethnographic study of how young people use Facebook in these online social networks, it is indeed to take their offline world online. So what kids are doing in these friendship-driven kinds of communities is exactly what they do offline. It's nothing different. So whenever we read about what's happening in Facebook or in MySpace, it is exactly what they're doing in their social lives offline. So even the issue of bullying, we know kids bully offline. They're now bullying online. It shouldn't be a surprise to us. But what we don't hear about in the media, and if there are folks from the media here today, it would be great if you wrote some stories about this. What we don't hear about in the media is another genre of participation that the research found, which we've referred to as interest-driven. Interest-driven participation is where kids are pursuing their interests and their passions. And it looks nothing like friendship-driven participation. It is highly social, and it's where kids are going into online communities to get better at things. It's where if they're interested in chess, they're going into chess communities online in order to learn different kinds of strategies, different ways of getting better at chess. It's where they're interacting with people who have greater expertise around any particular subject that they're interested in. These communities are cross-age. So where the friendship-driven communities, kids are online with other kids who are exactly their age. The interest-driven communities, they're peer-led, but peer in this instance, it's really important. We're not talking about when we talk about peers, we sort of envision hoodlums all of the same age who are causing trouble. Peer in this instance means people who are of the same interests. So it's cross-age so that it's like a pro-am community. People of different ages, different varieties of expertise who are all talking with each other, asking questions, exploring their interests in efforts to get better at something. And they're all self-directed. So let me give you a couple of examples. These are examples of interest-driven communities online. And I should say there are hundreds of thousands of kids in these communities. If anybody's familiar with the writings of John Dewey, these are the kinds of communities that John Dewey, a longtime philosopher of education, would be very proud of. This is an example. Kids love to write. Kids love Harry Potter. Turns out that kids love to rewrite Harry Potter and to take apart Harry Potter and to add whole new characters, add whole new chapters, add whole new sections to Harry Potter. So Fiction Alley is a site that has hundreds of thousands of kids in it, and it's kid-led. They're young people who are running this site. I don't know if you can see this well. Kids can go in and talk. They can create. They can go in and see what other kids are doing. This is an example of a chat board. It's a forum where kids are all sorts of topics where kids can go in and figure out whether or not they want to write about the night bus. They can talk about Professor McGonagall's workshop. They're writing about different aspects and adding new sections to Harry Potter. This is an example of a couple of kids who are having a whole conversation about character development in Harry Potter. So it's not surprising that a Stanford professor recently found in a study that she did that not only is writing getting better amongst students, but that 38% of all the writing that kids are doing is happening outside of school. And that's what we're finding in these interest-driven communities. Chess is another example. science, there are tons of interest-driven communities. And so that's one of the core findings from looking at how young people are participating in digital media. So when I see that they're spending 7 to 10 hours online, I'm not sure that I think that's particularly a bad thing. In fact, I think that there are extraordinary opportunities online for kids learning. Second big finding is how do they move into these interest-driven communities? It turns out that they don't just plop into an interest-driven community, but that it's a very social process. They start out they're hanging out, they're in social communities with friends, with brothers or with sisters, and they see their brothers or sisters or their friends in an interest-driven community. They sort of see it, they get a sense of it, and they think, maybe that's something I'm interested in. They start messing around or tinkering. We don't always have so many opportunities for tinkering for kids these days, but messing around and tinkering turns out to be incredibly important in the learning process. They mess around, they tinker, they get a sense they might be interested in it, and move immediately, and then start moving into what kids call geeking out. This trajectory of hanging out, messing around, geeking out, turns out to be incredibly important. Third set of findings that I want to talk about. This is a backdrop. I'm going to be using this a lot, so I just want you to get a sense of it. The columns represent movement. For this picture, the columns represent movement across home, school day, after school, and then home again. So a different way of representing some of the things that I've just talked about in terms of kids learning. This is learning across a youth stay. So what we're learning as we think about the findings from the Kaiser study and from the ethnographic study, the bottom here represents local community, and it represents what we already know in terms of kids' movement. They spend the morning with the family, their classroom. School, they may go to the museum or zoo. In the after-school, band, family. If you take a snapshot of a kid's day, if we also understand what we've learned from Kaiser and also from the ethnographic study, kids are also spending during that exact same time an enormous amount of time online. And we also know that each of these institutions and communities represent important relationships with people. And so we're beginning to map out what an ecosystem begins to look like for a kid. This is what their day looks like. It begins to be who they're interacting with and opportunities for learning. And if we take the ethnographic study seriously, we begin to understand that there are opportunities in this learning ecosystem across a youth stay for robust learning. And there's extraordinary potential here. And in part, particularly for the work that we've been doing, if we think about school, which is 14% of a kid's day, we start to think about learning as happening much more broadly. And so we move away from talking about just education and wanting to talk much more broadly about how to influence a young person's learning opportunities, which is across this broad swath of a learning ecosystem. But not all news is good news. So the research also tells us that there are some problems with the learning ecosystem. And you can, by looking at this, a couple of things come up. First, if you look up at the top, it turns out there are very few adults in the global part of the ecosystem. There are very few adults involved with the kids up top. That's one problem. Second problem is that when we talk about hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, turns out that really only about 10% of the kids are making it into the geeking out, the deep learning opportunities. 95% of the kids are in the hanging out and messing around. We're not getting the kids into the deep geeking out, and that may be because there aren't adults up there as well. Third big problem is fragmentation. What happens, the learning that happens in any of these sites, if we're really lucky and we have good schools like we have in Chancellor Klein's district, we have connections between school and home, and people and the family knows what's going on in the school and vice versa. But the rest of these bubbles, no connections. So what happens here, nobody knows. And the skills that the kids are developing here, nobody knows about. So there's no transparency or connection in the system. Third big issue, how do I get rid of that? Oh, cool. Third big issue is an issue that I would call almost a gap in culture of learning, is that there is no connection in learning between what happens above the line and below the line. So that if we talk about the kind of learning that is happening in the interest-driven communities, it looks like this. If we talk about the kind of learning that's happening in the institutions, it looks like that. And so when we talk to the kids, we've done focus groups with well over 100 kids in Chicago, similarly with over 100 kids in New York. And we talk to them about the institutions that are in their ecosystem and the relevancy. Not a single kid in any of those focus groups lists any institution as relevant for their lives. They can talk about school as relevant, of course, but not a single kid, if you ask them what's relevant for their future, will list a public institution, which is a problem for their ecosystem. And it's also a problem because if we want to bring adults into the global communities, the adults are in the institutions and the resources are in the institutions. And so now I'm going to move out of part one of the story that I'm telling today, which is a story about how kids are learning outside of school. And I want to move into a conversation about institutional transformation and change. Because in part, we have to start thinking about if we want to really take advantage of the opportunities in the learning ecosystem, we have to also start talking about institutional change. Because the institutions in the learning ecosystem are not relevant for kids from the kids' perspective. And we've got to start figuring that out. And so I want to give you examples from 3 institutions that are really trying to grapple with that. I'm sorry, I keep pushing the wrong button. So the 3 institutions, I'm going to start with the museum. Hi, back there. So the 3 institutions, I'm going to start with a museum. And this is a field museum, which is in Chicago. And what we've done, each of these stories of institutional change that I'm going to show you, each one is very simple. They've all adapted the vision of learning that joins onto the interest-driven approach, and they all have partnered or teamed up with and are drawing from the expertise of other institutions within the ecosystem. And so this is a story of a field museum, which is in Chicago. It's collaborating with Yowell, which is an online world that has over 3 million kids in it, and Global Kids, which is an online after-school program in New York. And I'm going to let them tell you a little bit about the work they're doing. Can you make that play? Really? So remember, as they're figuring this out, remember that museums, a couple things about museums. So museums are places where that are places where people come to go and sort of passively consume or look at information. Typically, for most museums, when a youth comes into a museum, that youth if an unaccompanied youth comes into a museum, it is not an unusual experience for the youth to be accompanied then by a security guard. And it is also, museums are places that curate objects. Are we getting lucky? None of my videos are going to work? I'm getting over the shock. Give me a second. Okie dokie. Okay. So these are really cool projects. So one's a project in a museum, one's a project in a library, and one's a project in a school. And if I can have my slides back up, then I'll just run through it really quickly. And I'll run through my point really quickly. Okay. So here's what I want to tell you. I'm just going to tell you the story of one example. Can you get rid of that little thing there? Thanks. So I'm going to tell you the story of YOUmedia. I'm just trying to think if it's on YouTube. So I'm just going to tell you the story of YOUmedia. So YOUmedia is a space at the Chicago Public Library. Chicago Public Library is the largest physical library in the country, and it is it's led by Chancellor of Chicago, Commissioner of Chicago Public Libraries, Mary Dempsey. And Mary Dempsey basically said, I have no youth coming to my library. They only come on school visits when they have to, and I don't know what to do about that. She had a 4,500 square foot space that was empty. She was using it for storage, and she said, basically, do something with this. Can you do something with this and help me figure this out? And so thinking about the ecosystem for young people, partnered with bringing in folks who understand games, a digital youth network program in Chicago that understands how to work with music, how to work with graphical design, and how to work with youth. I'm getting fingers in the back. Working together with librarians and youth, they created an entirely new space in the Chicago Public Library that was for teens only. And the idea behind the space was not that it was a space as a space for kids to come and play with digital toys. The idea is that it is a space for kids that has both teen librarians and mentors. And it is a space where kids are coming and they're actually using the content of the Chicago Public Library as context for the things that they're making and remixing. So what we have is a space where kids are actually using the content of the library, the books and the music, to remix and to make. Not sure what this is. Oh, it's a video from YouTube. Okay.
11 months ago, Julia and Connie approached us and said, we have this idea, and we think that Chicago Public Library might have the same vision we do for how you take digital media and you incorporate it into a wider learning opportunity for kids and for teens. And what you see tonight, 11 months later, is that creation come to fruition. This space is really the brainchild of the MacArthur Foundation. MacArthur did the concept, the design, the build-out, but the Pearson Foundation brought us the technology, and they are an invaluable partner to this.
This is not just a fun place for kids to play. This is a real place based on rigorous research that we are putting to the test.
We are in YOUmedia, which is our new space for teens in our central library, the Harold Washington Library Center. What happens in here is creativity. It really allows the library to be seen by teens as a place where they can give a full license to their creativity, whether it's in their love of literature, poetry, music, or their desire or interest in using technology and digital media to express themselves creatively.
It sits at the hub downtown. It sits across from at least 4 to 5 universities. It sits at the intersection of all of our public transportations. And it sits in a place where every kid, regardless of where they live in the city, can come. It also sits on the ground floor of a vast array of resources, books, music collections, video collections, a hub of information about the history of Chicago and the history of the world.
And one of the things we learned from the kids is that in many respects, school is a node on their network of learning. And so part of what we've been trying to do is to think about how do you build the infrastructure for a young person's network of learning. They're learning out anywhere, anytime. And it turns out the library is one of those spaces.
We were very upfront about, no matter how we design the space, the most important thing would be the quality of the mentors and the librarians to encourage students to take advantage of the space.
Well, growing up on the south side of Chicago, kids need an outlet to express themselves. If they don't have that outlet, they turn to the alternative. So this space gives kids the outlet that they need. I mean, they can pretty much come down here and construct some type of media to express themselves. So if kids like to do graphic arts to be more creative, or if kids like to make movies or music videos or write songs, do poetry, they have a space where they can come down here and do that.
One of the things we've learned from the research is that kids learn best when they're following their own interests and their own passions. And we think every kid that walks in the door is going to have their own interests and passions. As soon as they start pursuing their interests, they're going to have a set of questions and want to get better at something. And that's the hook. That's the connection to a mentor who can say, you know what, here are some things that you can do.
My future goal is to be a music producer and to start off in hip-hop, but not just staying there. Like, I want to go into different genres and learn about everything, so I just won't be stuck in one mindset.
I think making sure you present students with a challenge of not just saying go deep into one field, one trajectory. So do more than just be an expert music producer, but also spend some time on your writing, spend some time exploring video production, game design, etc. So I think even if they don't do any of those, 5 years from now, in terms of exploring a career path, there's definitely a skill set and a disposition that's built there that comes out of that process. And we try to maintain that in our programming in whatever context it may be.
It really changes what the library means inside the community and what it means for the kids who come here. It used to be, I think, that kids would come to the library to take information and bring it home. And what we think now is that kids will be bringing information to the library and using the center here as a way to be able to distribute and share what they know with other kids who come to the center, and other kids in the city.
Yes, I'm Prince Rocky Matego. Yes, somehow I'm about to show you that my foot is never can be your stop. Yes, I'm higher than the sky. I am the true fact. Yes, my feet.
Thanks. Couple things I want to tell you about that. So in a place that actually had no kids coming in, once the teen library was created, once the U-Media space was created, there are more than 100 kids coming a day from across the entire city. It also has a virtual online space that is designed around interest-driven learning called Remix Learning that has more than 1,000 kids in it. And I'm going to skip through this because we don't have the video and close out part 2 of the conversation, which is to say that part of a couple of things that you would have seen in the other 2 examples, but that you're seeing in the U-Media example, is that one, what's happened across all of the 3 examples that I would have shown you, and that is true of the U-Media, is that 2 things. One is that all of the institutions, in order to move into dramatic institutional change, are understanding a new vision of learning, and 2, they're pulling expertise from across the learning ecosystem. And these are all the partners that were involved across the learning ecosystem, involved in the U-Media, the library transformation. And so part of what we're learning around the institutional change is what we've been learning around innovation. So Kareem Lakami, who's someone who's been studying innovation in the sciences, has argued and has found that innovation comes not from new ideas within the same field, but rather the application of ideas from adjacent fields to an existing field. And so what we're seeing in the innovation of the library, for example, the innovation didn't come from within the library field, but it came from the adjacencies. And those adjacencies are from within the ecosystem. And so and it's true for the museum example that I would have shown you. So part of what we're learning, and this is the ecosystem for learning for kids, as they're pursuing their interests, part of what we've learned from the innovation in institutions is that not only does the ecosystem of learning for kids exist as an ecosystem for learning, but that we're beginning to learn that it is also a platform of innovation. So what do I mean by that? So a platform for innovation, if you think about just the iPhone ostensibly is just a device, it's a phone. But because of the resources and assets that Apple made available to developers, it is also a platform for innovation. And so developers have begun to make applications that applied to the phone make it a better phone. And what we're learning about the ecosystem for learning is that it is also, if given the right resources and assets to those communities and institutions involved in the ecosystem, that they can begin to become also innovators on that platform, so that you have almost a virtuous cycle. It is both a site for learning, but it also becomes a place of innovation. So let me give you a concrete example. So now moving into part 3, and then I'll be done. Led by Diana Roten in New York, the Social Science Research Council, we've invited 13 institutions to become a part of beginning to think about what it would mean to build an ecosystem, a connected ecosystem in New York. These are the 13 institutions that are involved. If anybody's from New York, if you look at that list, you immediately begin to think these are very different institutions. So one of the core things about an ecosystem is that none of the members of an ecosystem are very different. That's absolutely critical for innovation, and it's critical for an ecosystem, and it's critical for kids' learning. Secondly, all 13 members have bought into a common vision of learning. It's the interest-driven learning and the principles that I've showed you on some of the slides. Third, they all have common incentives around participating in an ecosystem. One is they understand the disconnect between the global community that I've shown in the ecosystem and their concern about their relevancy. Secondly, they all understand, they've seen new media, they've seen in an ecosystem that's successful, there have to be beacons. There have to be institutions that represent what the future can be. There are some schools. Joel has been working with a school called the School of One. A school may be a beacon. The UMedia, the library site, can be a beacon. We're working on building other beacons in New York, but there have to be institutions that represent a future vision that they all can be working towards. The museums are also worried about their relevancy in the future. So there are many incentives for their participation. Third, there are a set of resources, whether it's, and they're all worried about digital media and their future, and so we have provided a set of resources for them to be collaborating across all of the institutions. And so what does it look like for them to begin to work together in the way that UMedia has begun to work together? So we've asked them all to begin to think about how they might start to work together. Here's an example. In New York, they call themselves a New Youth City Ecosystem. Cooper Hewitt, which is a design museum, is working with the public library, is working with Global Kids, a whole set, a peer group, as well as an online game called Manhattan. So they are beginning to work together to begin to build projects very much like the UMedia example that I showed you. Another example is City Lore is working with the New York Hall of Science, is working with Remix Learning, is working with other. So you can begin to see, and I can explain to you what these projects are. I don't want to go into great depth, but they're extraordinary projects, very much like UMedia, that are mobile, that are social networked, that with adults working across sites, that deal with transparency, that are bringing adults into the conversation, that are working across multiple institutions. And they continue to grow. And it's not uncommon, actually. We're doing this in New York and Chicago as well. Actually, kids are starting to come to us with ideas for how they want to build out the ecosystem. And so not only is this becoming a much stronger and more robust ecosystem for the kids, but it's becoming a site and a test bed for innovation. So what does it have to do with the schools? The final question is that they become a test bed for new learning and innovation for the schools, so that each of the institutions have traditional relationships with the schools. The New York Hall of Science works with over 10,000 kids in schools, as does the American Museum of Natural History, another partner. So as we begin to build out new applications and new projects, we can test them so that there are research partners involved in each of these projects. These are dramatically different approaches to learning that's being tested in each of these projects. We get to understand how successful they are or not. In order to bring any of these into the school system requires incredible change. Schools don't, as Chancellor Klein knows, schools don't allow mobile phones. They don't allow social networks. If we're going to start bringing in dramatically new kinds of learning into schools, it seems to me that we should have tested them, that we should have a much better understanding of how successful they're going to be before they move into schools. So these become the test bed for moving new projects into schools. And so all of the partners have begun to talk about, once we've tested these and have the evidence that they're worth bringing into schools, how they'll then work with their partners to bring them into the schools. And so we begin to have an innovation flow with schools as part of the ecosystem for learning. And that's the model that we've begun to work on both in Chicago and New York. And I will stop there.
Wow.
Oh, I have one more slide. The final slide goes to John Goodlad, which is to say, all new ideas are never such new ideas. In 1984, he's talking about how the ecosystem is absolutely necessary for learning. And while because of digital media, actually, I would argue where it's the first time that we actually have the opportunity to implement it. There. Now I'm done.
I think I'm probably speaking for the audience in saying you've given us a wealth of ideas, terms, not as many images as you hoped,
yes,
but enough to give us a feeling for the very ambitious and promising enterprises that you've been involved in. And simply hearing about kids and how they're spending their time and what are not high priorities for them, and then thinking about the wealth of institutions which exist in the society which have been increasingly remote for these kids, gives us some sense of the challenge of creating an ecosystem where things connect for kids, for those who are officially involved with their education, teachers and parents, and then for the many other institutions which potentially can be involved, but the right mixture is just beginning to be discovered, and the Chicago and the New York examples, I think, will be well worth watching. A big word in the past has been systemic thinking, but now we have to do eco-systemic thinking. And as a punster, I can't help thinking about the ECO, but also the ECHO, because unless for kids what they're doing in their social networks or in their geeking out connects to what's happening in school, what's happening in the city, what's happening in various institutions and media, then the potential will not be realized at all. Of course, we all want to hear Joel's thoughts about this. And Joel, of course, has been chancellor of the New York City schools for 8 years, but he had a life before that as a public official in government, as a lawyer, and as a law clerk as well, and also as the executive of a large media company, Bertelsmann. So I'm going to encourage him to wear as many of those hats as he wants, as he tells us what was the stream of consciousness that went through your head as you heard and watched.
Sure. Well, first of all, Howard is a man of many intelligences. That's what he's written about. I'm a man of many careers because I couldn't hold a job. So I have a lot of different perspectives on this. Let me first of all say I want to thank Connie. I think in a way you've glimpsed the future. There's a tremendous amount there. This is very rich to eat at one meal. The real set of questions, and they have several dimensions, is how do we make this transition in a way that changes the way instruction takes place, not just inside the schools, but really in what Connie is calling a larger ecosystem, how we bring to bear the various pieces so that we make it work for our kids. But from my point of view, as somebody who runs a school system, the first challenge, which was alluded to, and I think is really important, is how do you create an environment where innovation becomes part of education? Mostly in education right now, innovation and education are almost never used in the same sentence. And those of you here this morning, I mentioned this notion. I mean, for as far back as anybody can remember, we have one teacher, 25 kids, they get a textbook, they get some worksheets, and that's the model. And in a prior life, when I was a lawyer, I used to represent the American Psychiatric Association, so I had to have a psychiatrist joke. And my favorite psychiatrist joke was these old light bulb jokes, and mine was, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is only one, but the light bulb really has to want to change. And you see, what I've learned about the school, so you like that, Bob? Thank you. What I've learned about the school system, you can use it without attribution. But what I've learned about the school system is it really doesn't want to change, right? If you don't have a system that wants to think very differently about the way that Connie and others are thinking about this, then it's not going to happen. And I don't have enough time to list all the massive resistances to bringing in new and different ways of learning into the system. But one of the things we're now doing through partnerships and otherwise is to think about, for example, there are people developing platforms out there in which basically you can learn math through an online platform that is going to be so superior to the average delivery of math content that takes place in most classrooms in New York City. And there's no reason not to connect that to the instructional mission and have people involved in learning in very different ways. This school of one thing, now think about this, because this is a big idea, and it's in its early phases. In fact, if you've got the Atlantic magazine they put in your little orange bag that they gave you when you checked here, there's a couple of 3-page articles on this. But basically, what we've now done is, instead of thinking of one teacher, 25 kids, we've got each kid and looking at that individual profile, moving kids at their own pace, some learning online, some learning in small groups, some working together with each other in a social network, but taking on different challenges in different ways, constantly monitoring. Okay, I'm told we're going to start the Q&A, so let me just put a wrap on this. Constantly monitoring the different ways kids learn and let them move at their own pace and different. So I've got some kids now who are doing these video games that they love. But in order to become king of the universe, which is a goal that everybody should aspire to, in order to do that,
Queen.
These kids, or Queen, it's fine with me. In order to do that, you've got to learn increasingly hard mathematical challenges and solve increasingly difficult mathematical equations. And so as a result, you're incentivizing for some kids ways to learn. Then we study and develop an algorithm for each child, just the way Google develops an algorithm. And in part of my past, as some of you may know, in a career-ending move, I sued Microsoft, and that's why I became a schools chancellor. But I always had algorithm envy. And now we've got an algorithm that we use to see how different kids learn at different paces and different ways. We also are able to see which content works. We're also able to have our teachers highly specialized so that they don't have to teach every single one of 180 different lessons in the course of a year, but to focus. And what we're seeing now is much greater differentiation, driven by the fact that you can pair modalities, not just a single teacher modality, pair the way kids learn, and constantly improve this algorithm to drive change. Now, what Connie's going to try to do as well is to integrate that beyond the 6.5 or 7 hours that kids are in schools, to try to increase the networking across so that the learning experience doesn't become a temporal one. Now, there are a million issues here. There are legal issues about cyberbullying and everything, which we're now in the middle of in New York. And probably one of the most interesting challenges, how do you create a market to enable these changes, assuming the school system is one to change, to drive change? So when I was at Bertelsmann, one of the things I was responsible for was dealing with how we basically domesticate Napster. And we also had a music company. It was quite apparent to me that the music company loved selling CDs with 16 songs on one CD and sell them for $15.99 or $18.99 or whatever. And it was as obvious to me as anything that model wasn't going to continue to work. But it was working in the short term for the music company. And the same problem we face now with the textbooks. So I meet with the textbook companies and I tell them that in 5 years, we're not going to see textbooks in public schools, certainly not in New York City. But yet, right now, they don't want to cannibalize their existing business. And so as a result, textbooks are sticky. You can make a lot of short-term money on them. So how you create the environments, both within the school, in the partnerships, and ultimately in the market to drive this kind of change. But I want to tell you, if somebody who's looked at a lot of things in education, what's happening in terms of the way kids learn, our ability to use technology in a very different way, and ultimately to try to generate something that really people thought was unimaginable, which was to create an environment where innovation became part of the educational ecosystem, something that has been highly resisted in multiple ways. I'll end with my favorite story on this, because it'll give you just a small sort of insight into what I'm talking about. So in New York City, we create a lot of new schools and so forth, and I found that there were a lot of kids in schools where only 2 or 3 wanted to take an AP, Advanced Placement course, and we couldn't afford to give them a teacher. But there's some really great online courses in AP. So, however, we have a rule in New York State that says you can't get credit for a course unless you have a teacher in front of you. So here was the conundrum, right? So I went up to Albany and I said, I did this for every year for 6 or 7 years. And I said, look, I got these kids, they want to take the AP course online. And if they pass it, they get college credits. So we should give them high school credit if they pass it. And if I got to give them a teacher, they won't be able to take it. So the people would always say to me, well, look, the rule is you got to have a teacher to get high school credit. I said, I understand that. That's why I came up here to get a waiver. I said, because, no, you're laughing, but this is a real world. And I didn't make this presentation once. I did it a handful of times. I said, I came up here to get a waiver so that these kids could take the course. And after all, if they get college credit, it must follow as the night of the day. They should get high school credit. And so they said, well, that's not the way it works in New York State. So this gives you some sense of the dimensions of the challenge. And finally, to end on a realistic note, is in addition to all of that, some of these new approaches, as we roll them out, they're not going to work well. And we've got to be prepared for an environment in which change, for all the great things that have happened with the internet, there have been a lot of failures as well. And we've got to be prepared as we make this transition to understand that not everything we will do will enable us to spin straw into gold. But this is a glimpse into a future of an entirely different approach to the way kids learn.
Let me simply say that one of the wonderful things about the MacArthur Foundation is it's actually trying to look at what succeeds and what doesn't. In the past, it's been much easier to get money just for technology than it has been for systematic research on what's effective and what's not. And you're right, a lot of it will not be effective, though sometimes the ineffective things will be very revealing. I have one more question for each of you. I'm going to tell you what it is, and then you can think about it if you want while we take a few questions from the audience. And that is, the role of teacher, as you say, has been pretty unchanging for a long period of time. Looking ahead in the next decades, what do you see as the new roles which will emerge to keep this ecosystem from exploding? But I'm sure there are lots of hands, and I will try to recognize at least a few before we have to close. Gentleman there?
Mr. Klein, what problems are you having with the union in New York, wanting to advance the ideas you just put forward? Is the union cooperating with you?
Yeah, it's like everything else. There are times when we disagree and times when we agree. But on some of these ideas, we have been working with the union. The whole notion of why you required a teacher in order to get credit was obviously an antiquated, feather-bedding notion that we had to move through. And now the state is much more amenable to new and different ways. I think that they're finding, and I think the union will support this, they're finding that the use of these technologies will empower teachers. We're going to get back to Howard's question, which we'll wrap up with, but the evolving role of the teacher. And one of the things, after my morning discussion, a teacher came up to me, and I really appreciated trying to think about how we make teachers become change agents in the educational system. We've created a culture in which this is a demand-pull kind of transformation, and we've got to figure out a way to engage teachers in both becoming empowered but to become change agents in the system. And technology can do this. I'm convinced of it.
Yes, all the way back there. Yeah.
I just had a question about how you all envision the evolving functions of schools, especially as we move closer into or further along in the 21st century. And some of the pushback that you spoke to, Klein, I imagine is from sort of a lack of understanding of how some of the old school thinkers incorporate technology into schools because of one key reason, and that's assessing the learning process. And if you all could speak to those two things. So how do you merge the two worlds, right? Because what you all discussed was the process of learning, and from an educational sort of administrative perspective, the assessment of that learning is what matters in terms of dollars and, sort of a systemic approach. So I'm curious as to what you think about those things.
I think both in the near and in the long term, assessment's going to change dramatically. So what we see outside of school, so if you think about assessment as feedback as well, what you see in the online world is young people clamoring for feedback and assessment. You actually see them getting very upset when they don't get it. So in a world that's around participation and production and kids are actually making things that they care about and producing and creating, they want to know how to iterate and make it better. So whether it's the writing, whether it's a science project they're working on, whether it's a media production, they immediately want feedback, and they can get it from peers in the interest-driven communities. And so we see that as something that's absolutely critical. In the game world that Joel was talking about, and in a school that that's been created in Joel's iZone called Quest to Learn, which was one of the videos, games have also embedded assessments inside them, so that part of it is if you master a task, you know that you get feedback immediately from within the game. So that the digital media is also providing kids, players, people who are learning with immediate feedback in ongoing ways. And so as we begin to move that into schools, we'll have much less of a need for those in the assessment community call it drive-by assessment, where you get it at the end of the year, but it's not particularly helpful, to assessments that are immediate and ongoing so that kids can actually get better at what they're doing in real time. And that's how I see the integration starting to happen.
The whole apprenticeship master-mentor analogy, which has been so important for learning throughout history, I think needs to be raised in consciousness now for those people who are in charge of assessment. I'm thinking of Judith Fabian here, who's from the International Baccalaureate, and I hope at some point during the festival you'll be able to hear her thoughts on this. Other questions, comments? Yes. Chuck? And then back there.
I'm interested in the implications for minority and poor kids. Connie, do you think this will widen or close the gaps?
I think without intervention and without the kinds of things that we're seeing, U Media space in Chicago and others, right now we have concerns around what I would call a participation gap. So, for example, I think in the 90s we talked a lot about an access divide. And I would say that we have much less of an access divide now, and we have a participation divide, which is to say that we have kids with access to technology who are consuming, but have not moved into in the words of the ethnography, into the geeking out phase, and have not really learned how to participate and produce. And that is across race, class, and gender, and that's what our concern should be about. And so without either moving this work into schools or into the institutions at the local, on the ecosystem, where with the adults, we have real concerns around divides, around race and class.
Just two quick comments on that. I mean, the one thing we seem to know quite well from all the research is the most important thing in a kid's education is the quality and effectiveness of his or her teachers. And when it comes to that, we also know kids who grow up in high-poverty neighborhoods are disproportionately getting teachers who are not particularly effective. So there's an enormous gap there that reinforces any other achievement gap. If we use technology effectively, and we have ways that engage kids in differentiated modalities, I think we're going to be able to close that gap. And it also, if we do this intelligently, we should be able to raise, in a significant way, raise the quality of our teaching force by helping to empower them and understand teacher doesn't have to do everything. It's nuts to think a teacher is going to do 180 different lessons each year and nail them. I mean, it's just, and particularly, first-year teachers in very struggling environments. And why don't we get intelligent about the way we do this and do a much more integrated, effective approach? When I see it happen in School of One, so I've got teachers who are doing the Pythagorean theorem, but she's doing this. Instead of her 25 kids, I've got 90 kids. Some of them are up to the Pythagorean theorem, so she's doing them with them each day for 3, 4, 5, 6 days in a row. And so she's actually become very proficient at that. And we'll start to think about this as if we actually cared about the results we got, not simply about the inputs we have.
Jay?
So at the Harvard School of Public Health, we've been running a media campaign to recruit volunteer mentors for at-risk youth. And today there are some 3 million volunteer mentors around the country. And my question is, because I saw mentors up on your slides from time to time, what are the opportunities to, because one of the most important barriers to recruiting volunteers is people say, I know mentoring is important, but what do you do with the kid? And if you can match adult and child around shared interests and shared passions, this concept of the interest-driven community is incredibly powerful. Yeah. And I wonder how you see mentoring becoming integrated within that.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, there are several, actually. And so I actually think that in many respects that becomes, in part, the backbone of the ecosystem and is absolutely huge. Nicole Pinker's actually sitting in front of you, and Nicole has done an extraordinary amount of work in this area and has been part of the U-Media work and is building out a whole set of online work in Chicago as well around the mentoring, as is a woman named Jean Rhodes at University of Massachusetts at Boston, who's one of the country's leading experts in mentoring and is developing a whole set of systems, and we're working with her as well. But I think that that's one of the cornerstones that's going to have to happen around this and is absolutely critical. And it actually begins to bridge, there have been a whole set of issues around the mentoring, both, as you said, around what to do with the kids, but also around geographic location and how to match that, but both because of the digital online world, and if we can match around interests, those things start to fall away. And it becomes actually what I think is a keystone for making this work. And there are models, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
Yeah, let me make a brief comment here. The oldest joke about the Internet is on the Internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. Mentoring doesn't have to be from somebody who's older. It just has to be somebody who's more expert. That's a Copernican shift in many, many spheres. But in the work we've been doing, which is in the ethics of the new digital media, and that's a whole other topic, there really is a hunger among young people for people who can tell them about how to think about things like trustworthiness, ownership, what it means to participate in a community. And there, it's less likely, on the average, that somebody who's younger than you is going to be able to provide guidance. So that's a place where, again, the ecosystem has to take advantage of whatever wisdom may exist among the people who aren't so good at tweeting. Yes, I think we'll take the last question from the floor there, and then we'll have the one more question from the audience. Woman in the center. Yes.
Dr. Kathy Klug, Aspen Public Schools. I wanted to ask Dr. Gardner to go back to his original question, which is, please, both of you, describe for us the new 21st century teacher. Because what I'm finding is there's a bigger gap, even to than our student-to-student gap is our teacher education gap. Mm-hmm. And what we're finding is we're the ones not prepared for the 21st century role that we need to take. And so I'd be very interested on your perspective on how to prepare our teachers better for their new role in this marriage of digital and educational requirements for the century that's already here.
Right. That's the question, in fact, that we want to end on. But let me simply say, with the passage of time, of course, teachers will be much more digital natives. There may still be a gap, but it won't be particularly acute. I think the issue which we're all struggling with is what kind of new roles, whether they have the word teacher in it or not, do we need to help people navigate this ecosystem, particularly since we know generations are so short now. And 5 years ago, we would have been talking about an entirely different set of technologies than we're talking about today. So, Connie?
Joel go first, and then I'll pick it back.
Okay, Joel.
Sure. So this is a good question and on in several ways. First of all, We do have a challenge, but it's a leadership and it's a management challenge, and it happens in all organizations. Now it's at Bertelsmann, transforming Bertelsmann to a digitally sort of informed organization. Those are questions, and one of the things I've sort of touched on. I just want to leave you with this thought. The road to school reform is littered with good ideas poorly implemented. And if we don't understand the role of leadership and management in transforming complex social organizations, we're going to miss the boat. Those words are kind of verboten in the edu-speak world. People sort of say, well, that's technocratic. But in fact, that's mission critical. So how we get, if your teachers don't buy in, this doesn't happen. And so it's really a massive challenge. Second and third points that I want to kind of wrap up as I finish go back to what I see the role of the teacher. And it has two dimensions. One, I'd be remiss in not pointing out, we were joined today by Justice O'Connor, who has been really driving this role of education in civic preparation. The future of our democracy is going to depend on something other than people just being able to get online and into social network groups. Values, a sense of history, a shared commitment to what it means to be an American. And these are critical things that she is driving, and I believe whatever else happens, the teacher is going to have to be at the fulcrum of what Martin Buber calls the I-thou relationship. I don't know about any other school system, but my kids in New York depend enormously on human interaction with adults in the system. And whatever else goes on here to help the instructional mission, there is another function that we have to be cognizant of. And in that regard, it just seems to me that's one that we've got to make sure our human beings are terribly engaged in, because at least in the Bronx and in Brooklyn and so forth, the kids depend upon that enormously. And I just remember so many times sitting down with kids and having that discussion in a way that's very, very powerful and transformative. And that I see is at the heart of what the educator's role is going to be in a highly souped-up, technologically driven instructional system.
So 3 things that I would add in addition to Chancellor Klein's recognition of Justice O'Connor is that, and so one is, as we've done all of this work in digital media, is acknowledging how absolutely critical the face-to-face is. And that's not ever going to change. And so that's absolutely critical in terms of teachers' role. But one is we've got that it won't be sage on the stage and it won't be one teacher standing in front of 30 kids. That absolutely can't remain. As we think about what's happening in the business world, people are working in teams and they're collaborating. I see teachers moving in that role as well. So I see them working in teams and collaborating with students. I think the mentoring metaphor is an important one to hold for teachers. I think their role will be as important in helping kids navigate the ecosystem as it will be in managing content and the other roles that they play now. Third, I think that understanding that teachers, I think we right now expect teachers to do everything. And part of the value of an ecosystem is to be able to pull expertise from across the ecosystem, and we should expect teachers to be able to do that as well. Part of what we see happening in Chicago is actually that the teachers don't have to be as digitally literate as one would imagine, that they can either turn to the kids or they can turn to other aspects of the ecosystem to pull that digital expertise. They have to be experts in the kids, and they have to be experts in understanding whether or not the kids are progressing and being able to develop those relationships with the kids, as Joel has responded to. And if they can then manage the resources of the ecosystem to make sure the kid is progressing in a team and collaborative way, then we've got the best of both worlds. So I see the teachers much more in a mentoring, collaborative role, having expertise around certain content areas. I don't think that's going to go away. And helping kids manage the ecosystem and managing their trajectories along pathways.
There are many people in the audience who could have contributed knowledgeably to our topic, but we're fortunate to have had, as I said at the beginning, probably the 2 most knowledgeable people about American public education on the one hand and learning and citizenship in the new digital media on the other. It's great to have them together. It's great to see the worlds talking to one another. I think we have a better sense of eco-learning, though also I think we have a sense of how complex and what an unfinished story it is. To end on a hopeful note tied to the last question, in research we did with young people about whom do they trust the most in the world, right after their parents came their teachers. And I think that's a solid basis in which to build. Thank you all. Have a good lunch.
Thanks.